The first time Caleb Mason saw the pile, he almost drove past it. It sat behind an abandoned silver mine at the edge of a small mountain town, stretching across the hillside like a giant scar. For decades, everyone had called it mine waste. Broken rock. Dust. Old stones nobody wanted. But Caleb noticed something strange. Tiny red flashes were shining between the gray rocks. He climbed out of his truck and picked one up. He wiped the dirt away. A deep crimson crystal stared back at him. Caleb frowned. He had seen stones like that before. But he wasn't sure. So he put the rock in his pocket. He had no idea that one small stone was about to change his life. Caleb wasn't a wealthy man. He owned a small piece of land several miles from town where he grew vegetables, kept chickens, and raised a few goats. His farm wasn't large enough to make him rich. It was simply enough to keep his family going. But that year had been difficult. The cost of fertilizer had risen. Feed was expensive. And 2 months of unusually heavy rain had damaged part of his vegetable crop. Caleb needed another source of income. That's why he had agreed to clean up the abandoned property. The old silver mine had been closed for decades. The owner wanted the land cleared before putting it up for sale. Caleb offered to remove old fencing, clean the access road, and haul away some of the loose rock. The owner laughed when Caleb asked what he should do with the huge waste pile. "Nothing," the man said. "Nobody wants that stuff." That sentence stayed in Caleb's mind. Nobody wants that stuff. The next morning, Caleb returned with his old pickup truck. He walked toward the pile. The rocks were everywhere. Some were gray. Some were brown. Others had streaks of white quartz running through them. Then he saw another red flash. He picked it up. Then another. Then another. Caleb stopped working. He looked down at the ground. There were dozens of tiny red crystals scattered among the stones. He grabbed a plastic bucket and began collecting them. By lunchtime, the bucket was half full. Caleb didn't know whether they were valuable. But he knew one thing. They weren't ordinary red rocks. That evening, he took several pieces to a local jeweler. The jeweler examined them under a bright lamp. He turned one stone over. Then another. Then he looked at Caleb. "Where did you get these?" Caleb pointed toward the old mine. The jeweler smiled. "These are garnets." Caleb's eyes widened. "Are they worth anything?" "Some are." The jeweler paused. "Some aren't." He explained that garnets came in many varieties. Most weren't especially valuable. But certain colors, sizes, clarity, and varieties could attract collectors and jewelry buyers. The jeweler offered Caleb a small amount for the stones. Caleb didn't sell them. Instead, he asked another question. Would there be more? The jeweler laughed. If those came from the mine, there could be. The next morning, Caleb went back. This time, he didn't look at the pile as garbage. He looked at it differently. Every rock became a possibility. He began sorting. Gray rocks went into one pile. Quartz into another. Red crystals into buckets. Large stones were separated from small ones. For several days, he worked quietly. People in town noticed. One man stopped his truck beside Caleb. "What are you doing?" "Sorting rocks." The man laughed. "Those are mine leftovers." "I know. You're wasting your time." Caleb smiled. "Maybe." Then he went back to work. After 2 weeks, Caleb had filled 12 buckets. But he still didn't know what he really had. So he contacted a gemologist in a larger city. He carefully packed several of the best stones and mailed them for identification. A few days later, his phone rang. The voice on the other end sounded excited. Where exactly did these come from? Caleb explained. The gemologist told him some of the stones were ordinary garnets. But several were unusually attractive specimens. They had strong color, good transparency, and natural crystal shapes that collectors might appreciate. The gemologist gave Caleb advice. Don't crush everything. Some of the larger crystals could be more valuable as specimens than as jewelry material. Caleb looked across the mine waste pile. For the first time, he realized something. The people who had abandoned this place had been looking for silver. They had measured the mine's value by what they could extract from underground. They had never bothered to ask what was sitting in the waste they threw away. Caleb began researching. At night, after feeding his animals, he studied garnets. He learned how collectors evaluated specimens. He learned about cleaning and preserving crystals. He bought inexpensive tools. A small rock hammer. Brushes. Protective glasses. Storage boxes. He even built wooden shelves inside an old shed on his farm. Every stone was carefully cleaned. Every interesting specimen was photographed. And every good crystal received a small label describing where it came from. Then Caleb did something that surprised everyone. He started selling them individually. Not by the bucket. Not by the truckload. One stone at a time. His first online listing received almost no attention. He waited. Nothing happened. Then, 3 days later, someone bought a small garnet crystal for $18. Caleb stared at the screen. $18. For one stone. He smiled. The next week, another sold for $31. Then one for $47. A collector bought a larger specimen for $85. Caleb couldn't believe it. The pile that everyone called worthless was slowly turning into income. But the real surprise came one Saturday morning. Caleb was working through a section of the waste pile that had been covered by years of dirt. He moved several large rocks. Underneath them was a layer of reddish material. He carefully loosened it. Then he saw something much larger than anything he'd found before. A garnet crystal nearly the size of his thumb. Caleb picked it up. It was dark red. Clear enough for light to pass through parts of it. And its natural crystal shape was almost perfectly preserved. He didn't know its value. So he didn't make a guess. He sent photographs to several collectors. Within days, people began contacting him. One collector offered $250. Another offered $400. Then someone offered $600. Caleb sat at his kitchen table staring at the messages. $600. For one stone. He eventually sold it to a serious mineral collector. The money paid several overdue farm expenses. And Caleb realized something important. He didn't need to find one giant treasure. He had something better. A resource that kept giving. Word began spreading through town. The same people who had laughed at Caleb started asking questions. What exactly are you finding? Are those stones really valuable? How much have you made? Caleb never bragged. He simply kept working. He developed a system. Every morning, he spent several hours sorting the mine waste. In the afternoon, he cleaned the best specimens. At night, he photographed and listed them. He kept records of every sale. Some stones sold for $10. Others for $50. Some for more than $100. Most were ordinary. But occasionally, he found something special. And those rare discoveries kept collectors interested. Then one afternoon, the owner of the abandoned mine visited. He looked at the buckets inside Caleb's shed. Then he looked toward the enormous waste pile. You're actually making money from this? Caleb nodded. The owner shook his head. I've driven past that pile for 20 years. Caleb smiled. So have I. But you saw something I didn't. Caleb looked at the stones. I think I just looked at them longer. Months passed. Caleb didn't become rich overnight. That wasn't the story. There were no magical diamonds. No secret underground vault. No unbelievable jackpot. Instead, there was something much more realistic. Patience. Research. Hard work. And a willingness to see value where everyone else saw garbage. By the end of the season, Caleb had sold hundreds of garnet specimens. Some went to jewelry makers. Others went to collectors. A few went to schools and museums for educational displays. And the old mine waste pile? It was still there. But it was smaller. Much smaller. One evening, Caleb stood at the top of the hill overlooking the mine. The sunset turned the rocks orange. He picked up another small garnet. It wasn't large. It wasn't perfectly clear. It probably wouldn't make him much money. But Caleb smiled anyway. Because he understood something now. Sometimes treasure doesn't look like treasure. Sometimes it looks like waste. Sometimes it sits untouched for decades. And sometimes, the difference between worthless and valuable isn't what's inside the stone. It's whether someone is willing to stop, look closer, and recognize what everyone else ignored. Caleb slipped the little garnet into his pocket. Then he walked back toward his farm. There would be more stones tomorrow. More sorting. More cleaning. More surprises. And somewhere inside that enormous pile of forgotten rock, there were probably still garnets waiting for someone to find them. One stone at a time.